Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Donation. I am your host, Matt Bitsagai, and I am joined today by my co-host, Noah Barnett. Noah, how are you today?
Hey, doing great. Glad to be back.
Yeah.
Episode 1 must have went okay. You invited me back. I know as a test co-host.
No, this is good. Super excited for today's conversation. Why don't you frame up like what our topic is today?
Yeah, so on episode 1, we really framed up what we're going to be talking about the whole entire season, which is more isn't the solution, but rather focusing on what matters most. And so as part of that, we want to unpack different aspects and elements of that. And the one we want to tackle today is this idea of how do you actually operate, even if you're a very, very small team, and you might need 10 people, you might want 20 people, you might have a should list long enough for as many people as you can handle. But the reality is we don't have that. And so the question becomes is how do we actually operate as a high leverage team, even if we're a really, really small team? How do we multiply our efforts? How do we think about if we're going to set this up, how do we make sure that it's going to run efficiently even when we're not touching it? There's a lot of different ways that you can really build a high leverage team, and we're going to get into it today.
Yeah, super excited for that. I think maybe the place to start in that conversation is what stops a small team from being able to operate, super efficient. Like what are time wasters that we see happening within, our customer base and even sometimes within our own company? Because we, like a lot of our customers, we're a small team that really operates at a very efficient pace. And so, what are some of the things that we see that can kind of cause us to go off track there? I think that's an interesting place to start.
Yeah, and this is going to be repetitive from the last time, but I think it just starts first by having awareness of what you're actually doing every day and every week and every month. And so one thing I think that you can do proactively to determine where there are these places you're spending a lot of time is actually just to index where you're spending time.
Mm-hmm.
And so things that become time wasters, or not time wasters because it's still valid time, it's just the leverage of that time investment could be better used somewhere else, are things that you're going back to doing time and time again.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, let's say you need to print thank you letters off every single morning for the donations that came in yesterday. And you do that every single morning, and it's a manual process, and you do that, and whether it's 3 or 25 donations, you do it every single morning. Now the question is, okay, like what part of that process could be automated, or is it something that you only have to do twice a week? Is there something, maybe there's a bulk set of tasks that you do. So it's like admin tasks like receipting or something like that. But you tend to do those in the morning, and then in the afternoon, you're doing other admin tasks, but they require kind of the same mode, for example. So I think that's another opportunity to look for areas where you can optimize, is actually batching similar tasks into the same time period that require you to be doing the same types of things. So if you print stuff off in the morning and you print stuff off in the afternoon, what if we just did all of our printing tasks in the afternoon, for example? That's a great example of that. But what do you see, Matt? Like, you talk to a lot of our customers every single day. Where do you see organizations kind of fall into this trap where they're spending a lot of time, yet maybe not getting the yield that they need to really focus on what matters most?
Yeah. I think one area that we, do kind of see pretty regularly, especially with newer organizations coming into the fold at DonorDock, is, not fully understanding or having a great feel for their different like types of donors or donor segments, for example. And then I think what that leads to or can lead to is that we are kind of putting equal effort across all of our donors, regardless of really like the value. And I never want to act like every donor doesn't provide value to an organization. And I certainly don't mean it when I say, but I do think that there are very clear times where kind of making the decision of one-to-one versus one-to-many engagement as it relates to the donor base. And I think we see a lot where if you don't have good segments or you don't have good data, you don't really understand that, you can't really apply that kind of thinking to for this scenario and this set of donors, I'm going to do something that is more of that one to many engagement to be able to kind of maximize my efficiency and time. But for this other set of donors, I really need to do more of the one to one engagement today. And so I think, you know, when we see people coming in and they don't really have a clear picture of that, it can lead to not what I would call wasted time. I don't think that engaging with donors is ever really wasted time, but just lack of efficiency in how best to engage across the donor base and through those various donor segments. And so I think that's a really big one that can be something that, if you can work through that and you can figure that out, can really, change kind of how you change your approach and how you're spending that time. And we talk about wanting to spend our time on what matters most. Part of that is just, having a good picture of what is it that matters most. So
Yeah. And you bring up a great point that I kind of want to bring it back to like a framework as you're thinking about this idea of how do you operate at a higher leverage. It's really getting higher performance out of the same amount of input. And I think there are like three categories that we might want to separate or decouple from each other. The one that you just brought up, which is prioritization. Where do you actually focus time and make sure that you're focusing time on the most impactful parts of your organization's operations or your fundraising group or your donor segment? So there's that like priority bucket. Like, let's make sure we're working on what matters most. And by focusing on what matters most, we're going to get more output naturally. The second bucket was kind of where I was leading to initially, which is really looking at kind of the processes or the to-dos that we have to do. You're not going to be able to offload them, or, you can't stop sending receipts or any of these types of things.
Yep.
And that's more about like, when should I do certain tasks, or are there processes we can put in place to make this task more efficiently? We talked about bundling tasks. If I have to print, let's bundle these together. If I need to be writing emails and thanking donors, let me do all of that at one time,
Yep.
whether I'm sending my major donors an email update or sending my newsletter. So it's like batching tasks. And then the third one would just be around, where are there things that we have to do or we just do today because we have to get it done? Yet there's likely some updated process, maybe automation,
Yep.
partnering with technology. Maybe it's even outsourcing that. Like, hey, this is something we've just been doing over and over again. But honestly, like a volunteer could probably do it if I spent a couple hours doing an SOP
Yeah.
or kind of writing out this process. So it's not actually working on the task. It's working on not having to work on the task in the future.
Yeah.
Which is almost this third bucket. So I think if you look at it from these three angles, like I need to prioritize where I invest my time. I need to batch and kind of bundle the tasks and the workflows that I do need to do to make them more effective and efficient. Even just for me, context switching, I get so in the weeds. I don't know if you feel this way, Matt, where I'm like, I'm going from Slack to this, to writing an email, to working on this podcast right now, to back to video. And it's like, sometimes that just in of itself kind of brings down the productivity. And then again, that third bucket, which is what could I work on that basically prevents me from having to do certain tasks in the future, whether it's enabling someone or training them or setting up automations.
Yeah, and that third bucket's really interesting to me, because I think in some cases, we may be aware of a better way to do it or a better tool or something, but it's actually taking the time to set that up and fighting the urge to say, it's just faster if I just do it. I'll just get it done faster this time, and maybe I'll look at that next time. And I find myself doing that at times, where it's like, gosh, I could probably show someone else, how to do this. But gosh, it's just easier if I just get it done, and then maybe I'll figure that out next time. So I think there's some like human piece to that, where it's like we sometimes know. I think often we might know that there's a better way, but it's like getting ourselves to take that step is the hard piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, it's trying to prioritize like, what can you uniquely do? Let's say you're the leader of the development team and you do need to spend time meeting with major donors. That's something you uniquely can do. Whereas there might be things you like to do that other people could do. And I think that's just like a gut check. And I'm feeling
Mhm.
that right now. My
Yeah,
face is like getting big. And
yeah,
Matt, it looks like you're
for
shaking your
sure,
head where it's
for
like,
sure.
they're the things if we're honest, we have preferences. We might really like doing that admin task because it lets us check out a little bit and spend an hour, typing those numbers in or whatever, right?
Mhm,
Versus saying, I can just train someone to do this, or I really need to set up that automation that DonorDoc's been talking about, or our technology partner, or I need to set up that integration so that, my CRM talks to QuickBooks instead of us doing the import export every month. But that requires me to learn something that new.
yeah,
The thing is that might be a 4-hour project, but it might save you 4 hours a month
mhm,
going forward.
yeah,
And those are the types of ways I think lean teams, really teams that are thinking about staying small, being scrappy, um, focusing on what matters more or most versus just doing more.
mhm.
These are the types of things and kind of procedures that are iterative. And you talk about this a lot, even in fundraising, Matt, around like an iterative process. So I don't know if you want to talk about that because a lot of this can be overwhelming. So, how can someone take like an iterative approach to some of these, let's call it productivity upgrades for them and their team?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with understanding that like the fastest way to not make progress is to not start. And sometimes it's actually like starting something that feels really really hard, because especially if we feel like the if we aren't going to have time to do this the perfect way that we want to do it. I say it all the time, like, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And the reason that I believe that is because of the opportunity to iterate on things. And so you can always make things better. So if I'm sitting here thinking about how do I get started, the first step for me is to try and identify what thing am I trying to solve here right now. So if it's, I know that there is this process that if we spent some time we could probably make it better, it would save us time in the long run. Maybe I don't have all the pieces in place to get it exactly the way I would want it to, but if I can start on this today and make one step in of progress, and that saves me an hour a month, knowing that next month I can probably do the next piece of that, or I can look at how did this work for me over this last month and where can I continue to improve it. And that's kind of that idea of iteration, is that it's continuous improvement. We don't have to do everything. In software we do things where we put out what we call a minimally viable product, and that basically means, like, what is the smallest piece or thing we could deliver that starts to deliver value, and knowing that if we get that out there we start to get feedback from people using it, and they help guide us into what we want to improve or change or make better on that in future iterations. And it's the same idea here. It's like, I'm going to start with this, and then I'm going to look at it and I'm going to say, this is what I've learned through this first step in this process, or through this minimally viable product of whatever my process that I'm trying to improve. Here's what I've learned over the last 3 weeks or a month. And this informs me on what I want to do next to try and make that even better. And so there's a lot of power in that idea of iteration, because we don't have to get it perfect on the first try, because we know it's built into the concept that we're going to keep continuing to learn and improve it over time. And so we talk about it in our smart steward method. I think it's a great way to operate a fundraising team, or even just a nonprofit in general, of, you know, we're tackling these things and these projects or these initiatives, and we are going to have a lot of learning. That this creates an opportunity for us to not have like completely static processes, because we know things evolve and change over time. And so we can evolve and change our processes through that iterative approach. And I just think it's a really powerful way to think about things and to be able to make progress on trying to be more productive, on focusing on the most important things without feeling the pressure or the burden that I have to have this perfect today or it doesn't make sense to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it brings up another framework that I think is helpful as you're doing this, as you're thinking about all of these ways that you can improve. I'm sure there are 5 things where you're like, yeah, clearly I could do A, B, C, D. And you even created this framework that said, hey, just start with one. I think what you can also do is you can look at those 3 buckets we talked about earlier, and you can apply them to 3 areas of your team or your workflow. So the first one is around people, which is what we've been talking about, is like, how can I or how can my teammate get better at where we spend our time or what we're focused on? Maybe we actually are, there's 2 of us working on the same thing too often. And we actually just need to clarify roles where it's like, hey, Matt, you're going to run with this and you're going to tag me in. And so that's just clarifying roles and responsibilities and what we'll define as the people bucket. What are you responsible for? What are other people responsible for? And is there a way to actually clarify roles and responsibilities to actually increase productivity across the team, even with just 2 people? Clarifying who's responsible for what and who can run with what could unlock tons and tons of extra bandwidth for you or for your teammate. The second part, which Matt, you just talked about a lot, which is around process improvement, which is like, what is the process that we have to do this? And can we be honest? Like, we've had the same process for 5 years, and it's worked for us for 5 years. But is there something else we can do? I'll just share a personal example. Is one thing that we do is we meet with new nonprofits probably 4 to 8 times a day across the team. We're talking with them. We're talking about how they're looking to improve their processes, how their technology is helping them, what their people are trying to do, etc. And for the longest time, our team would prep for 30 minutes and probably prep or basically spend about 30 minutes afterwards, really analyzing the notes, summarizing the details, doing all of that. And what we realized is that we were able to set up some automations using AI and other things that probably took 2 hours of exploration and almost just being willing to be a novice and say, like, I don't know if this is going to work, but let's try it. And someone on our team was able to develop a full process where basically we can put the organization's information in, all the details, everything we know about the nonprofit. We can then run that process and in 3 minutes get basically a full executive summary of everything that preps us for that meeting. And then after the meeting, during the meeting, we can spend 100% of our time focused on the nonprofit because we have AI in the background doing summary and notes for us. That then gets put back into AI. And in 3 or 4 minutes, it produces a full summary of everything we talked about, what the next steps were, all of those details. So something that took our team an hour per meeting of prep and kind of follow up now takes like 10 minutes at most for us to be able to get all of that. And what we didn't lose is the actual humanity and the personalization of that. And it actually freed up our time to stop spending time on admin and actually spend way more time listening, asking great questions, making sure we're including everybody in the conversation. And I think, yes, this applies for us because we meet with a lot of new nonprofits every day, but you meet with a lot of donors, you meet with internally. And
Yeah.
so where within these processes we have, can we say, let's revise this? Like, let's actually take this month and rethink about how do we prep for donor meetings and how do we then kind of download all of the details to that? And there's any way we can improve that.
Yeah.
And so that's really that second bucket is what are the processes that we can improve and work on in an iterative approach? And I think the third bucket is the technology side. Like, what are the technology
Yeah.
tools that we're using to power our processes and our people? Because ultimately, when you look at the technology, your processes, and your people, that's the system. That's kind of like the battery pack that's powering your organization's strategy. And so basically looking across these 3 buckets, looking for the 3 things we said earlier, which is what can I offload? What can I actually just, batch or bundle? And then where can I actually, partner with technology or prioritize better to focus on the right things and what matters most. And so these frameworks combined, Matt, I think with your iterative approach gives a lot of practicality to how you as a leader can really implement this at your organization, not sometime or this month or maybe next quarter, but really today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Do you think, just to kind of, I want to double click into the bucket where we talked about like batching things up, you know, um, do you think that there's a tendency when we are looking at, okay, I do these tasks, I'm going to batch them together? Because I think you're right. I think so. Like for me, I do pretty well in getting bounced around from one thing to the next. But I know that for a lot, and I think some people do, but for a lot of people, that that distraction, or getting moved or having to like focus on one thing and then immediately onto something else, and you lose your train of thought, that can be really disruptive. So the idea of batching makes a lot of sense. But do you think that we have, or there's a tendency to sometimes, um, rather than be trying to think of a better process that could replace something that you're doing, that we just say, oh, I'm just going to batch this together and do it all at once later today? And like, where's the balance? Like, how do you find the balance of like, you know what, like, I don't actually know that I need to print receipts daily. Maybe that's a weekly thing that I'm doing, or maybe there's an automation or something like you said around technology that could like remove this from me having to do this completely. So,
Yep.
so how do you, like, what's the advice for how to find like those areas where batching makes sense because I have to do that, or, but I don't, like, I want to also be thinking about, is there a better way for me to be doing this? Rather than just saying, I'm just going to keep doing it, but I'm going to do it all at one time of the day,
Yeah, I think that's the art of this. And I think it's almost like if I'm imagining like a DJ or a conductor, and it's like I need a little bit of the drums, I need a little bit of guitars, I need some flutes, I need different things. Like you really are a conductor of how your organization collaborates together to drive this change. And at some point in time, you may need more drums. And that might be, hey, we're just going to start with batching. We're going to start with bundling. We're going to get better at that. As we begin to do that, then we're going to start exploring the flute, which we have no idea how to do, which is changing our processes, doing different things. And then we're going to introduce like the electric guitar, and like we're going to use automation and AI and all of these really fancy things that sound fancy. They're very practical to move through. And I think giving yourself, again, permission to not know exactly what to do, or to know that maybe you choose to batch and bundle when you should just do better. Okay, we're still learning through that
still making
process.
progress, right?
Exactly. And I think that's what this podcast, this season is really all about, which is we've been told over and over and over again, and I spent almost 7 years running fundraising at a nonprofit, like, we just have to do more. We just have to do more. And when
Yep.
we do more, guess what our reward is? Do you
More
know,
to
Matt?
do.
More to do. Bigger fundraising goals, more donors to manage, higher expectations. Like it's always more. And more is almost this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that kind of like feeds itself, feeds itself, feeds itself, feeds itself, which doesn't allow us to slow down enough, take a beat, and kind of work through these processes, these frameworks. We have these 3 types of improvements. We have an iterative approach to those improvements. And then we kind of have 3 vectors of our system that we can really begin to audit: people, processes, and our platforms we're using. And all of those are partnering together to power the strategy. So we're going to talk a lot about strategy too. You even mentioned a few things there about how to prioritize strategy and think well about this here. But I think a lot of net benefits from this episode is really focused on your systems.
Yeah.
Like, how do we actually get work done? And is there ways to improve that?
And one thing I would think, like, in just talking through that, what is, so people who are listening, like, what's something they can go and start with today? Where I would honestly start, Noah, like if I'm listening to this podcast and I'm trying to kind of figure out, okay, where do I go from here, or what do I do? I think the first thing I would recommend to our listeners, is to actually go back to something you said right when we first started talking, which is this week, start indexing what you're spending time on. And maybe not just you, but have your team. Like we went through this exercise not that long ago where we're like, let's for let's for a full week, let's keep track of what we're spending time on. And
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't have to be like down to the minute detail. What we did was we really looked at like the buckets of time we're spending. You know, I'm spending X on this area or this kind of generalized task. But it allowed us to come back together and kind of look at that and say, wow, we didn't realize that we were spending this much time weekly across our team on X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you start to have, now you have some learning, now you have some data in front of you that can help to kind of inform you and build that roadmap of maybe the first thing we're trying to do is take that look at it along the lens of how do we kind of be more efficient in the things that we are doing. And so maybe we take that information, we start figuring out how we're going to batch those processes up. But I really think a practical thing for people to do to start working through this is to start keeping track of and indexing where they're spending their time.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a framework that I learned through some kind of like coaching training, which is called like the ACT technique. And the ACT technique is just starting with awareness, which is what you're referring to. The C stands for curiosity. Like, that's interesting. We spend 6 hours doing receipts every week. That's interesting. Like, you don't have to like
You're
shame
not
yourself for it.
solutioning on it. Yeah.
No, you're not
Yeah.
solutioning yet. You're just becoming aware, which is indexing. The second thing is this curiosity, which is you're beginning to ask questions about it. Or you're like, that's really interesting. We say major donors are our number one priority this quarter. But when we did this awareness exercise, we only spend 2 hours a week across 3 people focused on major donors. That's like interesting, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so that's the curiosity part. And then the T is really like the transition of the turnaround, which is like, okay, now can we do with that? But again, you have to start with awareness. You have to start with curiosity. Then you get to the turnaround, which is like, what could be true? What else could be true? What else could we do? Like you even said with the betterment thing, which is like, hey, we're doing all this receipting process. Like, do we really need to send receipts every day? I know somebody someday in the past said receipts have to go out every day, no matter what. It's like if we sent receipts on Tuesdays and Thursdays, like that's probably good enough for our organization. And that frees up 5 hours of our time to go do something else, you know? So that's really that technique of applying that. And it starts with awareness. Second is just asking questions of that awareness. And third is just turning around and saying, hey, how could we transition to something else? Or what
And
else could be true?
you know what's beautiful about that idea and that framework, and it really follows actually a very similar thought process to the smart steward method that we
Mm-hmm.
talked about, where it's like we have our evaluate, which is where we're learning, we have our establish, which is where we're kind of looking over everything and figuring out, then we have our execute. But it's a similar idea, but it fits so well with that concept of iteration and an iterative approach, because guess what, you don't just do this once. So you can do this, you can go through those steps, the ACT steps, and then guess what? You can run for a while and then you start again with with your A step again, where you're getting the information as to what it looks like today compared to what it looked like a month or 6 months ago. You're getting curious, you're learning about how what you've done now has changed or impacted, and then you're figuring out how can we go do this again and take the steps again to start to transition to what we want next. And so, it really does all fit really well together and creates that opportunity for continuous improvement without having to like make the right call every single time the first time. And I just think there's a lot of power in the whole concept all put together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again, it's about action, you know, and ironically it's the ACT technique or the ACT approach. But
Yeah.
like at DonorDock, one thing we want to do, whether it's using our software or listening to this podcast or, you know, even what Rob does over on the Focused Fundraiser, it's all about taking action. Like, what can I do today? What can I do this week to really move forward on whatever I'm trying to get better at? And so we hope you walk away from this episode really acknowledging that there is something you could do just today to move this forward. So as we ended the last podcast, I kind of want to keep this as like a end of segment, is like, what's the one thing you already shared a little bit about this week, like indexing your thing, but what's one more thing that someone could do today to really help them increase their leverage of their time and their team's time inside their nonprofit?
I think one thing that's kind of maybe overlooked, we touched on it a little bit, but we didn't go very deep into it, is looking at other resources that you may have. So again, I'm going to go back to my answer is my first answer is your homework after this episode is to start indexing what you're spending time on. I think that's a really practical thing to do. But I also think that there's probably other resources you may not be thinking about that you can help move some things along. So maybe you have some skilled volunteers within your organization that can take some of the things that you're doing, and you just have to like figure that who are those people and ask for that help. Maybe it's trying to get more board activation around some of the tasks that are happening. So I would say, another practical thing that can be done today is to look at those external resources that you might have at your disposal that you may not be leveraging to the full capacity that you could be. Pick one thing that you're going to try and, get one of those external resources to help you with this week, and make that ask that question.
Yeah, I think that's a great opportunity. We so often feel like we have to do it all. And so I love the idea of saying, let's open our eyes and look out and see what other resources we might have to tap. So we'll leave it at that. I think for me, it would just be asking questions about what you see in your workload, and not critiquing, but really asking questions like, why do we do the process this way? And not like, why the heck do we do the process this way? Like, that's different. But it's like, there's a reason why people are doing the way they're doing. There's the reason why you operate the way you do. Why is that? And just kind of like allowing that curiosity to sit and see what you learn. And then come back next week when we're going to talk more about how do we focus on what matters most and not just having to do more each and every week.
Can't wait. Thank you all for joining us today on this episode of Beyond the Donation. We look forward to talking with you next week, as Noah said, about how can we get the most important things done every single day. Thanks, Noah.
And let us know in the comments on YouTube or in the podcast review of what you did, what you learned. We'd love to hear as we build up this show. We want it to be more like audience engaging, especially on YouTube. So leave comments. Tell us what's going on. I will definitely bring those into future shows.
Love it. All
Thanks,
right,
Matt.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Noah.
See ya.
See ya.